Dobroveče, poštovani predstavnici privrede, partneri i prijatelji Palate Nauke. Hvala vam na razumevanju što ste sačekali 15 minuta, ali kao što znate, profesor Dani Rodrik savetuje decenijama države i kompanije i to savetovanje se odužilo i u ovoj instituciji. Svi svakako znamo da za 10 godina nećemo imati odgovore ko će nam sve biti potreban u kompanijama, ko će voditi istraživanja, ko će voditi inovacije, ali znamo da će pobednici raditi na ljudima, širenju znanja i osmišljavanju novih ideja. Upravo zato je i nastala zadužbina Miodraga Kostića, odnosno Palata Nauke, koja nakon 102 godine bivanja bankom danas predstavlja jedno zamešateljstvo istraživačkog centra i centra koji inspiriše i budi radoznalost. Zato je u poslednjih samo godinu i po dana ovu instituciju obišlo preko 150.000 ljudi koji su želeli da dođu i vide šta to u zadužbini Miodraga Kostića postoji u ovih 5.500 kvadrata. Mi smo dobili razne nagrade, ali je meni u našim izveštajima ovih meseci najzanimljivije to što imamo 20 istraživačkih centara Palate Nauke i 20 timova koji vredno rade na otkrivanju novih horizonata znanja, razmišljanju o novim tehnologijama i novim idejama, jer u Palati Nauke se o budućnosti samo ne priča. Mi ovde budućnost stvaramo. I za kraj želeo bih pre samog predavanja da vas pozovem da pozdravimo jednu viziju zbog koje smo večeras u ovoj zgradi i čoveka koji je tu viziju nastavio i dalje, pošto je otvorena zadužbina Miodraga Kostića. Molim vas da pozdravimo predsednika MK grupe i predsednika upravnog odbora AIK banke, gospodina Aleksandra Kostića. Izvolite.
Such a great introduction from Nemanja, but I'm going to switch to English because they told me English should be the working language. So welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm very glad that all of you are here in the Palace of Science endowment of my late father. I'm very grateful to Mr. Vlahovic that actually we can be a partner of the great event that you have managed, I would say, to bring to Belgrade, and that Belgrade is the host to it. Professor Rodrik, thank you for, I would say, visiting us and giving us the lecture. I will just say one brief thing. This I would say, building started from something that I would say runs deep in the beliefs of my family and of my late father, and that is knowledge. Hopefully something of which we're going to be, I would say, more filled of after the lecture that we hear from you. Knowledge is something that I would say he has taught me and my sisters, and I think most of our colleagues that's something that nobody can take away from you, and that's the motto that sort of he has been passing on to us as kids, to his colleagues, and I think to the closest friends. And I think that that's the motto by how this endowment was created, to leave something for the younger generations here in Serbia, to provoke their critical thinking, to provoke, I would say, them to explore the unimagined, the universe, and to provoke them to seek for some new questions, I would say, and answers. I hope that you like the building. I gave you a small, I would say, introduction of what we have here. Nemanja also repeated this in Serbian, and I hope you're also all going to enjoy it, and looking forward to the lecture and to have a cocktail and drinks and comment on the lecture after. Thank you all.
Should I get up here? It seems very odd to be sort of stepping up onto here. Well, thank you very much. I'm very delighted to be with you, and I just want to thank my host, the Serbian Association for Economists, the MK Group, the two Alexanders. Thank you very much for the science, the the Palace of Science, which is such a beautiful place, and I feel it's almost like a sacrilege to be talking economics. That is such an unbecoming topic in such a beautiful place. I should be lecturing on Venetian art or medieval architecture, but unfortunately, you're stuck with economics with me this evening. The topic of my presentation is where we're going in globalization. This is, of course, a topic of very intense discussion because after a very long time where we took for granted that we were living in a world economy which would become progressively more integrated, that trade barriers would become fewer and fewer and lower, we are now in a period of turbulence, and probably nothing illustrates that turbulence better than what we have experienced in the United States with President Trump's trade policies, which have really changed significantly, as you can see from this graph, which is about average rates on import tariffs in the United States. And you can see how sort of the big spike in these rates that have taken us back essentially to all the way before the Second World War in terms of the average level of tariffs in the United States. And is in many ways a very significant reversal in the US administration's approach to the global economy. The first main point I want to make is that Trump and his tariffs and what we see here, the sudden reversal in trade policies in the United States, are really something that had been happening and which there were signs for quite some time. If you look at indicators of world trade, and we can measure, on the one hand, the volume of trade, on the other, the volume of cross-border financial flows. So if you will, it's those two sides of the world economy, trade in goods and services on the one hand, and financial transactions, lending and borrowing on the other hand. And then normalize it by the total level of economic activity in the world, which is measured by total global GDP. What you see actually is that the turning point came quite a bit before Trump's second term. You can see that the global share of trade in GDP actually hit its maximum point right around the global financial crisis of around 2008, 2009. And since then, it has essentially stabilized relative to global GDP. So it hasn't fallen off the cliff, but we were used to trade, especially because trade now means, sort of supply chains and different parts and components crossing national borders, that this total volume of trade would actually exceed every year the rate of growth of GDP. And that is no longer the case. So we had seen a period of, we had already had experienced trade beginning its stagnation. In cross-border financial flows, it's actually even more drastic. You can see again that just before the global financial crisis, cross-border financial flows reached their maximum. Most of that collapse since then is actually what has happened in Europe, in the Eurozone system, that a lot of this internal transfer of resources through the flow of saving and lending that has collapsed and has not revived. So this is, globally the aggregate that there has been something going on in our world economy that actually predates Trump per se or these tariffs. It's even more striking if you look at the experience of individual countries. Take China, which I think is not sufficiently appreciated, what has happened, how China's orientation to the world economy has actually reversed. This is a very odd thing to say because we think of China that's increasingly dominating the world market, especially in manufacturers. But if you look at how much of China's economy is oriented towards the world economy, again, measure it as the share of China's exports in its GDP, it's fallen. It's fallen significantly. It's fallen by about 10 percentage points of GDP, which is huge. And the comparison there is with India. India's reduction in export orientation is not as drastic as that of China, but you can see that it's sort of after many years of increase in export orientation, India has begun to turn a little bit more inward. Today, it's remarkable to say that actually India is more export-oriented than China is in relation to its size of the economy. So there were things going on, and there were also had its political counterpart. Again, Trump is maybe an extreme example of a trend that was already existing in Europe and in the United States towards increased support that right-wing especially, but populist authoritarian leaders and parties were gaining support. So authoritarian populist vote share in Europe has now been increasing for some time. And I think the underlying set of factors that was causing these was a lot of turbulence and shocks in labor markets that created distributional problems, created difficulties for the middle class, created joblessness in a lot of regions for combinations of both globalization and automation, and in Europe, especially the austerity shock that followed the Eurozone crisis. And these shocks left durable scars in the labor markets and have contributed to the rise of far-right authoritarian populist leaders and movements. So I think all of this suggests that there were some deeper problems with the model of the world economy, the model that I have called hyperglobalization, to distinguish it from other models of globalization. And you'll see a little bit better what I have in mind when I talk about different models of globalization. But think about hyperglobalization as the model of globalization that we pursued from the early 1990s onward until the last decade. What was the features of that model? I think on the trade front, it was a model of deep integration, which is that trade agreements went from being really agreements about reducing barriers at the border, import tariffs, quantitative restrictions, to agreements that increasingly reached to policies behind the border. So trade agreements started to gain traction on domestic economic policies, whether it's investment policies, industrial policies, agricultural policies, subsidies on intellectual property rights. A much more extensive set of arrangements designed to integrate national economies together by trying to remove much more than just the transactions costs associated with barriers at the border, essentially trying to harmonize domestic regulations alongside to remove impediments to trade. On the international financial side was, of course, that financial globalization, the free flow of finance, with hyperglobalization, went from being an exception, because under Bretton Woods, until really the early 1990s, free flow of finance, absence of capital controls were more the exception rather than the rule. But the norm, the expectation under hyperglobalization was that there would be no impediments to the free flow of finance. And that system, I think, the system of hyperglobalization created a number of internal contradictions, number of tensions, which I think these trends that I've listed both on the economic and political front simply reflect. So there are 4 of these important tensions, and I want to briefly talk about them because when we talk about the future of globalization, we need to understand why we cannot actually return to its recent past, that it's not going to be feasible to recreate that model of hyperglobalization, and I'm going to argue that we need a different framework. One very important feature of hyperglobalization, and a very important contradiction, was that actually the countries that did the best in that system was not necessarily the countries that were following the rules of hyperglobalization. So what did I say? Hyperglobalization was about deep integration and removing impediments to capital flows. Which country was the biggest beneficiary of hyperglobalization? It was China. And of course, China did not play by those rules. China played by a very different set of rules that in a second I'm going to call the Bretton Woods rules, because the Bretton Woods rules allowed countries to engage in extensive industrial policies, to manage their economies, to use state policies to restructure and diversify their economies. And Bretton Woods policies enabled countries, permitted, in fact, expected that they would be managing capital flows and their exchange rates as well. That was exactly what China did. So China had the benefit of playing by a very different set of rules at a time when other countries were actually pursuing openness as fundamental driver of their growth strategy. Whereas the strategy in China was leverage the world economy, but combine it with a set of domestic investment and industrial policies to diversify your economy and gain new areas of comparative advantage over time. Now, I think the example that I always contrast the Chinese experience with is the experience of Mexico, because Mexico, in some sense, was the country that tried hardest to play by hyperglobalization rules. Not only that, it was actually positioned in the best geographical position to benefit from hyperglobalization, being just south of the largest market in the world, the United States. And after the especially after the early 1990s, and with the signing of NAFTA and Mexico joining the WTO, the strategy of the Mexican government for growth and development became joining the world economy, opening itself up to trade and foreign investment, attracting foreign investment, joining North American value chains. And the paradox is that Mexico did absolutely terribly. The north part of Mexico did well, but if you look at Mexico as a whole, not only did it not grow very rapidly, but in the period since the joining of NAFTA, total factor productivity growth in the Mexican economy has been negative. So it's not that they did worse, that did badly by East Asian standards. They did badly even by Latin American standards, which is saying something. So point number one, that there was, what was working was not the rules per se. And I think it's an important point to bear in mind when people point to China and saying, look, hyperglobalization was actually wonderful because, China managed to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Yes, but it wasn't through the policies that the advocates of hyperglobalization were promoting. The second, and I think this should not have been a surprise at all to economists, is that hyperglobalization, which was sort of deepening economic integration, brought significant redistribution to developing countries, drove to advanced economies. It drove a wider gap between the winners of trade and financial integration and the losers. And the fact that increased globalization, increased trade integration has distributive effects within countries is actually baked into the theory of comparative advantage. That it is an implication, a direct implication of most of the models of comparative advantage that we teach our students in our classroom, that when you open up the trade, some groups are going to benefit, some groups are going to lose out. It's a very general result. So there should not have been any surprise about that. And in the case of US and Europe, I think most of these distributive effects played out regionally. Parts in the United States, those parts of the economy that were hit by imports from Mexico or hit by the China trade shock suffered long-term declines in the path of wages or increased joblessness. And you correlate that with support for Trump, or you do a similar kind of analysis in Europe. You correlate the effect of the China trade shock with support for far-right parties, and you indeed find that this support tends to increase when you've had these adverse labor market shocks. Third, the political component of this was that the centrist political forces at the time, whether center-right or the center-left, essentially basically refused to respond to electoral demands and stakeholders' demands to address some of these distributional costs and some of the problems with respect to challenges on fair trade, how to address China, and so forth. Before the WTO, when you had an import surge, what would an advanced country like the United States or Europe do as a safeguard? Would actually negotiate some voluntary export arrangement or trade restriction with the exporting countries to deal with an export surge, deal with the domestic social problem at home, and it was a kind of like a safety valve to take off the social and political pressure while the system as a whole remained in place. That was true even under Reagan, who was a free trader. But Reagan, of course, negotiated voluntary export restraints with Japan, and so did, at the time, European countries. Once WTO came into force, VERs and similar bilateral arrangements to reduce the growth rate of exports when countries were facing pressure at home for political reasons, they became illegal. You couldn't do it anymore. What did politicians do when there was pressure? They told their electorates, they told the workers or the businesses that were adversely affected, this is how the world works. There's nothing we can do for you. Globalization is immutable, adjust. Okay? A couple of nice quotes that I use for that. I mean, it's one from Bill Clinton, another one from Tony Blair. Interestingly, both politicians of the center-left, but when it came to globalization, the message from them to their domestic electorates was, we can't do anything because globalization is something like a physical phenomenon. It's like physical equivalent or the economic equivalent of a force of nature like wind or water is what Bill Clinton called it. Or Tony Blair said when there were sort of protesters outside the Labour Party Congress, and he said, why are these people protesting? Debating globalization, you might as well debate whether autumn should follow summer. Again, so this physical metaphor that there's absolutely nothing we can do about this. And these quotes now literally sound silly because that's all that we're doing now is about debating globalization. And it turns out that all those rules that we thought were immutable were actually rules that we made and they can change. And now when we say that, all this line about taking control back, right? Economists tend to think this is a very silly thing because, of course, countries had a lot of control. Like Britain, Brexit, the big winner, political winner, was take back control. And economists would rightly say, Britain, the British government has all the control in the world that it could, it has the least amount of impediments of restrictions within the EU. But when your prime minister keeps telling the electorate that actually we don't have control, you don't have control because globalization is a force of, it's like a force of nature, it cannot be controlled, I think the message that was received, and therefore that ultimately resonated very well when the far right came and said, we are going to give you back control, reflected the existing conversation. The final point I would make, the final contradiction that brought hyper-globalization down was a very sort of optimistic and I think historically very ill-judged set of expectations about what the geopolitical and political implications of hyperglobalization would be in both the type of political regime and also the nature of international cooperation among different types of powers. The expectation was that once China joined the WTO, that it would basically pave the path to China becoming more democratic over time, and as a more democratic, more liberal, and open economy and society, that it would essentially become more friendly to China, that the geopolitical conflict would become weaker. Okay? So neither of those predictions, of course, materialized. China did not become more democratic, if anything, less so. As China, through its own very successful growth strategies, became economically and technologically more and more powerful, it began to be perceived as a geopolitical threat, and now turning, essentially increasing the logic of the international economy away from a kind of a positive sum logic of gains from trade and let comparative advantage play its course, to a zero-sum logic of geopolitical competition, which is that if China is winning, it must be that we're losing. And that changes, of course, the whole terms of the approach, most notably in Washington, towards the world economy. All right. So that would be my summary of sort of the internal tensions within the hyperglobalization system that ultimately did it in. The question is where we're going now. I'm going to give you actually a fairly optimistic scenario, and that might seem maybe a little bit naive because we're not at a good point in the world economy. But Trump will not be with us forever, and I think we are not living in a settled environment. I think we are in a moment of transition, and I want to at least suggest that there is the possibility of a positive scenario, and I need to rush a little bit given our time constraint. First, I think, is the point that we are not going to end up in a collapse of globalization. So, sometimes, we think about, there was a period of the interwar period when, in fact, the volume of trade spiraled down as countries increasingly engaged in regional trade arrangements and in increasing their tariff policies. So this kind of a significant decoupling that might be today's equivalent of that interwar spiral down of the world trade, I don't think it's really going to happen, simply because we're no longer in a world where essentially countries are trading finished goods and that most finished goods can be produced domestically. And we're living in a world where supply chains really have become totally integrated. So the economic costs of a complete decoupling would be huge. And it seems hard to envisage that we're going to have an outcome like that. I think and this is my optimistic take, I think either more likely, depending on which side of the bed I get up from, or at least a possible outcome, is that we might go back to a different kind of globalization. And so here I want to come back to my point about hyperglobalization was only one possible model of globalization. I've already drawn some of the distinctions with the Bretton Woods regime. Now, under the Bretton Woods regime, trade and long-term investment also increased very rapidly in the first 3 or 4 decades after the Second World War. So that was a globalized regime, but it operated under very different sets of rules, where, for one thing, there was no expectation of free capital mobility, and secondly, that the rules under GATT did not really reach behind borders, as I said before. So they were not as intrusive and countries were left pretty much free to do as they wished in terms of their trade and industrial policies, in terms of developing their own domestic welfare state arrangements, having their own fiscal tax structures and redistributive arrangements, and also managing their macroeconomy much more freely because of impediments or the controls on the flow of capital. Yet this was also a period when the global economy expanded very rapidly. I will argue in a second that actually the best thing you can do for the world economy is to let countries sort of solve their own domestic economic social problems, and if they're thriving, the world economy will thrive. And that, I think, was the Bretton Woods model. Interestingly, I think the hyperglobalization model, what I've called the post-1990 hyperglobalization model, was a case of returning back to the spirit of the gold standard, okay? Not just simply in the presumption that capital should flow freely, but also in the presumption that the international rules of the game should constrain domestic economic policy. And of course, under the gold standard, the main constraint was not only that you had to maintain openness to capital flows, but that you had to maintain a fixed arrangement vis-a-vis gold, no matter what happened to your domestic economy. If real interest rates shot up the roof, unemployment became 20%, you couldn't budge your exchange rate. You had to have a fixed parity vis-a-vis gold, and that meant leaving your domestic employment, your domestic economy essentially hostage to conditions on world markets. I've already mentioned that China was an exception to this because China actually played the globalization game during the hyperglobalization era by Bretton Woods rules. And that's sort of the good scenario in some sense of what I think in terms of a future global economic order will be to return to the spirit of the Bretton Woods era, where we recognize that we give nations significant room to manage their domestic economic and social problems, and we return to that period. And so the question here arises, if we're returning back to the spirit of the Bretton Woods era, we recognize that global governance or global rules will not be very deep, and they'll be constrained to a very few a number of domains. Would that really enable us to have a thriving world economy? Is there a contradiction between the two? And I'd like to argue that, again, based on the Bretton Woods period, but also based on theory, that this need not be the case. So there's a sense in which we need to reverse the logic that was once expressed by Christine Lagarde. This was at some anniversary of the Bretton Woods arrangement, and she said, Bretton Woods launched a new era of global economic cooperation in which countries helped themselves by helping each other. Actually, what happened in Bretton Woods is that countries were allowed to help themselves, and in doing so, they became progressively more open to the world economy, and therefore they also helped other countries. So I think and that's really my key point, is that the success of any future global regime is going to rest on the idea that countries help each other, that is, they become more friendly to the world economy, they contribute to economic prosperity by helping themselves first, okay? So in that sense, I think the problem with Donald Trump's policies today is not that he is too nationalistic, that he's pursuing the national economic interest, that he's putting the interest of the US economy first and foremost. No, because the policies he are pursuing are not good for the United States. That's the point. The problem with Donald Trump is that he has a very wrong conception of what US national economic interest is. And that's something you cannot solve through global governance, okay? All right, so let me just spend maybe 5 minutes before I close just to give a little bit more concreteness to the idea of how a regime that provides much more room for individual governments to manage their affairs can actually address global problems indirectly. And I'll do that by referring to what I think are two critical challenges that the global economy faces. And I discussed this in this book that came out late last year. So one issue is how do we achieve climate transition? The other issue is how do we address inclusion, equality, the reinforcement and the strengthening of our middle classes, which I think is fundamental to have healthy societies and healthy polities. Okay? Now, on the face of it, it seems like both require significant global cooperation, so that when I'm saying that we maybe should not rely too much on global cooperation and it's not going to be terrible, that I'm violating this. How are we going to do this? After all, addressing climate change, that's a true global public good. And it seems like in many advanced countries, Europe, the United States, that addressing the problems of the middle class and employment actually requires protectionism, trying to revive industries, manufacturing. And that means, basically doing things that's going to hurt other countries, especially low-income countries. I would like to argue that actually the reality in both spheres is different. The first, with respect to the climate change, is we have had significant good news on that front, and that hasn't come through global cooperation. It has come through national and subnational action. And the most critical component of these subnational or national actions, all having a kind of a national or subnational logic, is what has happened in renewables. You're all familiar with the renewables revolution. The price of solar and wind, electric batteries has collapsed. This is the greatest thing that has happened on the climate front, to the point where some of the most alarmist commentators on climate change, I give the example of Bill McKibben, who's well known in the United States, who was one of the first to ring alarm bells about climate change. He published a book last year called Here Comes the Sun. And you can tell from the title what it's about. But he's guardedly optimistic, saying that for the first time we actually have the possibility that thanks to this revolution, that we might be changing track, that we might be moving on a much more positive track. Now, where did this renewable revolution come from? It was largely the product of Chinese industrial policies, and that's sort of well recognized. Now, it's a long story. I'm not going to go through it, why China went into this promotion of industrial, promotion of solar and wind and renewable. And it's a combination, but it's emblematic of how a national logic can produce global public goods. Because in this instance, what China did was essentially say, this is the future, I better be ahead of the curve. Let me use this as a way of building national competitive advantage in these sectors, and in the process produce a huge global public good for the world economy as a whole. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't some adjustment problems in countries that are importing EVs or solar panels, but from the climate standpoint, it's undeniable that this has been a huge global public good. You can see, sort of all around the world how renewables have taken part now, sort of more electricity being generated through renewables than through fossil fuels, even in places like, Texas, many red states in the US. The second issue that I briefly talked about is about creating jobs, right? If we want to foster inclusion and equality, it's going to have to come through the creation of good jobs. It cannot be simply through redistribution. And I think if you think that the way to do that is going to be through manufacturing in the United States or in Germany or in France or even in some of the sort of more middle-income countries, the answer is no, it's not going to be, because manufacturing is lost jobs. And it doesn't matter. We have now had 3 administrations in the United States, Trump 1, Biden, Trump 2, all of which made it a priority to increase jobs in manufacturing through very different policies. And you cannot tell it because manufacturing share of employment continued to decline in the United States through each of these administrations. And it's the same pretty much in most other countries. Now, I think the strongest argument that you cannot generate jobs in manufacturing anymore is what is happening in China. Because China, of course, has been extremely, it's an understatement to say that China has been very successful in manufacturing, but not in jobs anymore. In the last decade and a half, employment in Chinese manufacturing has plummeted by tens of millions of dollars, millions of people, workers. In fact, China has lost more manufacturing workers in the last 15 years than the total number of manufacturing jobs that exist in the US and Germany combined. Okay? So this disconnect between value-added production and employment is a global phenomenon. You may want to protect manufacturing for a lot of reasons, national security, supply chain resilience, but if your worry is about creating good jobs, creating paths to the middle class, manufacturing isn't it. Where are the jobs going to be? The jobs are going to be increasingly in services that are non-traded and often require non-college education. Those are things like retail, food services, logistics, warehouses, care. So if you want to actually increase good jobs, increase paths to the middle class, you'll have to work. And this is increasingly true in all countries in the world in a very different type of sectors. The good news is that many of these sectors that I just cited were traditionally low productivity and productively stagnant sectors. But this is changing because of technology. Platforms, AI, new technologies mean that actually in the United States, labor productivity in many of these non-traded services has increased more rapidly than in manufacturing. Okay? And this is also true in a lot of middle-income countries. A lot of their growth is actually due to the expansion of services and increased productivity in their services as their their middle class expands. So there's lots of possibilities there. And that we'll need to think about how to think. We used to think about manufacturing requiring kind of an industrial policy for promotion. Now we need to think increasingly about how we can use industrial policy for services. And that will require different elements. One is sort of a kind of a more bottom-up kind of a approach built on cross-sector collaboration to create jobs, especially at the local and regional levels. And then an effort with respect to AI and new technologies to ensure that it can be directed in more labor-friendly ways and not simply to displace. That's a very long topic of discussion given the time, and given that's not my subject today, I'm not going to go much about that. The point, however, is that none of this has anything to do with trade. This is all about internal stuff, domestic economy. So if you really want to do the right thing for your own economy, address issues of equality, inclusion, job creation, the middle class, you don't have to do things that are going to hurt developing countries or necessarily require disciplines on trade policy. Okay? So let me then just conclude. I think we need a world in which we recognize that different countries will address these problems in many different ways. Often they'll make huge mistakes, as the United States, I think, has been making under the current administrations. But we need a rule-based order, if you will, where the rules are permissive in the sense that countries are generally free to pursue their own policies, trade and industrial policy, investment policies in particular. Doesn't mean that it is still an important role for global cooperation, but I think of that global cooperation more as one where it's a process of mutual explanation and reason giving. I'm doing this because it's important for my own national security, for my own economy. It's not doing this to hurt you. So there's a big difference between true beggar thy neighbor policies and policies that I might be doing at home for my own economic or social or political reasons, where you might suffer some costs, but that's really some incidental effect rather than the point of this. And I think that also is going to require greater policy experimentation because, as in my example of industrial policy for services, this is really uncharted territory. We have some examples we can build on, but we need many, many more. And I think Europe and many middle countries, middle powers have very important role in terms of being these grounds for policy experimentation. So with that, let me just stop. My point was to cheer you up a little bit about the possible future of the global economy, that it can be actually a better one, not the one that we find it ourselves in today. Thank you very much. Should I take questions? So, I don't know if you're up for it. I'm happy to take a question or two. If yes, or should I pick my own, or you want to direct, or I can. Oh.
Hi, thank you for this presentation. It was really great. I want first to challenge one of the things that you said, this comparison China versus Mexico. You said that, well, China did not follow like these strict rules, right? And maybe we can think that that's why its success, because it didn't follow this set of rules. But do you think that we can really compare China with Mexico? Because I remember when somebody once asked Adam Tooze, do you think that China is facing a middle income trap? And he said, like, can we really compare China with, and he said really Mexico, Indonesia, Turkey, like these are, you know, smaller countries with smaller populations, smaller territory. China is so different. I mean, I can understand why we are like obsessed with China, right? But it's really difficult to compare it with any other country. And this is just a, you know, like a small remark. The other thing is that I was discussing with my colleague whether you are still like pro-industrial policy, but for poorer countries. I mean, I understand your presentation was mostly like Western-centered, right, apart from China. But and of course for Spain or US, manufacturing is not interesting anymore. But like for Africa or any other poorer countries, are you still in favor of that? Because at the time when everybody was advising them, like go into services, you said, well, you should not skip this like industrial phase. So.
Yes, two great questions. One, China, of course, is a very large country and also very different historical trajectory and political system, has a lot of very special features. But I don't think that what China did and the basic strategy is hugely different from what much smaller countries in East Asia or Southeast Asia before it had done. So you go back to the way that South Korea and Taiwan managed their economies, Singapore did, Thailand and Malaysia less successfully, but also with good results. I think there is at a high level. I mean, the specific policies always differ, so we cannot take actual, sort of special economic zones from China and try to copy them somewhere else. But it is, a two-pronged approach. One is that you leverage the world economy. The world economy is important to discipline your producers and as a market and for learning, for technology. But you complement it with a domestic set of interventions to essentially move structural change much faster. And that typically requires industrial policies and, have been tax incentives, subsidies, local government policies in China. Sometimes it's just domestic firms or sometimes just foreign firms in the case of Singapore. So I think there are enough commonalities with other examples that I do think that the comparison is not so wild. Of course, the difference between when I talk of South Korea and Taiwan, they were doing this they were following Bretton Woods rules during the Bretton Woods era. The reason that China is interesting is they were doing Bretton Woods policies in a hyper-globalization era. The first, it's a do I still favor industrial policy for manufacturing in low-income countries? The short answer is I became skeptical about that as well. Just recently, a month ago, I published a short piece called how I became a manufacturing skeptic, because it's true that maybe 15 years ago I was writing on how promoting manufacturing was going to be important. I think I think it was whoever said that when the facts change, I change my mind. Sort of, what do you do, sir? What do you do, sir? It really is true. The facts have changed. I've looked a lot, very closely, at some of the most promising African cases, Ethiopia, for example, or Ghana or Kenya, and tried to understand what was happening. It's not working because manufacturing, the requirements, the skill, and capacity, technology, infrastructure requirements of successful competition in global markets, a successful entering global value chains today, have far outstripped the capabilities of incomes at that level of income, which is very different from what the case was in South Korea, Taiwan, even early in China, where the capability requirements was very limited. So you could put in a lot of very low-skilled workers into these factories and get the benefits of industrialization. So it's a very different context today, and that's why I do think that even low-income countries will have to pay a lot more emphasis on services.
Do you think that the fairly high bindings within GATS on services sector, trading services, which definitely affect domestic regulatory measure, how do you think that would affect the possibility of industrial policy within the services sector?
So I think GATS is again, I mean, GATS wasn't terrible in the sense that countries made voluntary sort of commitments, so there wasn't like one set of rules that everybody, but I do think that if I had my pick, I would say, how would I change the WTO? I would return it back to the GATT. In other words, get rid of the agreement on investment subsidies, agricultural, of that, but keep the dispute settlement, the new WTO dispute settlement, because that's great. So it's good to have good dispute settlement, but on areas where I think it's much narrower set of areas, border-focused trade measures. But once we sort of expanded the agenda so much, I think then you get countries feeling, even the architects of the regime eventually saying, no, this is not good for us anymore, as in the case of the US. Maybe one more question or comment? Oh, okay. Sorry. Maybe very quick, we can combine the two.
Very short one.
Yeah.
On one of the last slides, you showed that, if I got you right, nations can gain back their steering through concentrating on services and deploying AI in the right way. Now my question is, does AI is going into giant oligopolies? That's my feeling. How do you think this might influence that? So supranational and national.
Yeah. Okay, very quick, maybe, if you,
Thank you. In your earlier work, you point out to political trilemma. I think you remember those notions. And you said at the time that actually you can pursue only 2 out of 3. Hyperglobalization, national sovereignty, and democracy. Today we have actually national sovereignty, democracy is gone, hyperinflation is gone. If you were to rethink today, again, this theory, what would you do? Which elements of equation you would include?
So, I mean, I think, that political trilemma that you're talking about, which I've discussed, I think helps us understand why, we hit the problems and why this backlash occurred, because it's basically saying that, that on the face of it, governments and their leaders were telling people you could have all those 3 things together, that we're going to integrate our economies, we're going to maintain our democracies in the sense of our policymakers being accountable to their electorate and being responsive, and we're going to maintain our national sovereignty too. Don't worry, we can have all 3 of them together. And you couldn't, and that's why you ran into trouble. I remember a Eurozone finance minister telling me once, a few years back, and he said, the only political leaders who are willing to acknowledge the trilemma, and explicitly so, are the far-right leaders. because they explicitly say that you cannot have national sovereignty if at the same time you're ceding all these powers to the acquis communautaire and the European community, and that you either have to transnationalize democracy or otherwise your domestic democracy gets hurt. So I think so the trilemma, on the one hand, I think it helps us explain the constraints in which we ran into in the old system. I think it's still very valid for the EU. I think it still bites. And I think EU, by the terms of that trilemma, either will have to expand its polity, making it more Europe-wide, or constrain its economy, giving each individual country much greater room to experiment with their economic policies. That is really the fundamental structural problem for Europe as I see it, and that would be what the trilemma suggests. So I think there it retains its relevance. The other question was, I'm trying to, AI, oh my God. No, so yes, you're absolutely right. This is a big problem. I do think that that individual countries would have a lot of autonomy still in terms of how AI is deployed domestically, where I think globally you will need much more cooperation is on AI security, on sort of, so that's really a big area of global public good that I do think requires significant more global cooperation. My fear is that that's not going to happen until there is a big AI disaster first. That's really my fear. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you all for staying with us during this great lecture from Professor Dani Rodrik, and thank you, Professor, for giving us this optimistic view of globalization under our big globe here in the Palace of Science. And I can just call all of you to come in the future in Palace of Science. This should be one of the many lectures and activities that we'll have here. And I personally like to say thanks to Serbian Association of Economists and MK Group. This was really our honor to have you all today with us.
Awesome job.